Lily woke to a sound that lived somewhere between weather and memory. A fine, persistent tapping along the outer glass, as if a patient rain were learning the hull's name. It was not rain in the way the old maps called it, no wet sky behind it, just the slow, distant patter of micro-particulates caught in the ship's orbit, kissing the panes and sliding away. The hull answered with a low, steady hum, like a throat settling back into sleep. In the dim of her cabin, the world felt small and held, easy to measure by breath and by kettle. She let herself stay half in the seam of waking, letting the hum set the pace. The heater breathed at the foot of the bed, a benign animal, warming the air in a time that was neither urgent nor idle. Lily liked the way the ship kept time without telling it. She learned its rhythms by habit more than by clock. She slipped from the blanket, padding bare feet to the window to see the faint, cold glow of Nebula beyond. The depth, a soft indigo dusted with flecks of pale light. For a moment, she simply watched the smear of stars, hands pressed to the cool glass until she felt the slight resistance, as if the hull itself breathed through her palms. Her morning was a ritual of small hands. She moved to the galley with the kettle already queued. Lily liked the anticipation of the steam rather than the impatience of it. On the counter lay a strip of amber fairy panels, thin sheets that glowed like coals and were velcroed in places to catch light for the long hours. She eased one free, brushing away the faint film of night, and the kitchen breathed a different color. A warm honey that softened the chrome and the soft scattering of utensils. Tea was not a single ceremony, but a small choreography. Lily measured leaves in a tin that had lost its label over years of use. A scent rose, a bright bergamot that always made a memory of some other kitchen appear, of hands that had taught her how to press the tea leaves into patience. She put on a low steam, folded cloud bread dough onto a tray, pinched it into small rounds, and pressed a tiny thumb into the center for the spiced filling. A pale mash of slow-cooked molasses and dried fruit, warmed and fragrant, a pocket to hold against cold corridors. While the bread rose, she lit a row of fairy panels and nudged them so their glow spread in even panes across the counter. There was a tidy economy to these motions. Each object served both function and companionship. The kettle's sigh was a domestic punctuation. The bread, half-formed, was a promise. Lily liked the way simple acts could occupy a mind kindly, like a hand cupped around a cup. If this quiet voyage soothes you, stay with the drift, she thought to herself with the softness of a thought sent out like a note under a door. Seamus arrived first, as he nearly always did. He came in with a bag of small tools, leathery pouches, tins with labels in hand-worn script, and with hair the color of shipwood. He walked with a slow confidence, the kind that comes from repairing more things than you buy in a lifetime. He hummed when he moved, a tune that matched the hull and made it difficult to tell who walked with whom. Man and ship, companionable. "Morning," he said, and the word was folded up in his hands like bread. He sat at the counter while Lily cut the bread into halves and scored the tops into soft little petals. He watched the steam for a while, fingers tracing the seam of his cup. Rose came next, carrying a tray of seedlings in shallow trays. She smelled always faintly of green things, wet soil and the particular sweetness of tender shoots. Her hands were sure about plants, as if she had once been a botanist who had taken to small rebellions. "They woke a touch late," she announced, smiling. Two of them insisted on holding a nap. Mara and Joss followed, the twins, dragging in on a single rope of mischief and morning breath. Mara had a face that concentrated its focus on small things. She would bend to rearrange the sugar windows as if arranging constellations. Joss came with a pocket full of tinkered toys, bits of wire and crescented glass that tinkled when he moved. They argued briefly over the blue fairy panel, each making small points and concessions, then settled like birds into the long bench. The galley was the heart of things, if a ship could be said to have a heart. It traded in small economies. Jars changed hands like currency. Bulbs were given for favors. A tin of biscuits became a means to apologize, to celebrate, to mark another orbital pass. It was a place where arguments dissolved into cups of tea, and where laughter leaked like a warm dye into the air. Lily liked that her kitchen allowed for many hands without fuss. There were always shells of stories to pick out. Seamus would tell one about a light he'd once coaxed back into a pane and leave the better parts unsaid. Rose would relate the obstinacy of a sprout that refused to be pruned, and the twins would add details of how the sprout dreamt of becoming a ladder. "Have you tried the blue here?" Mara asked suddenly, holding up a strip of fairy panel against the window. The light caught it and went porcelain. The twins liked to spend time making small panes, nebula windows, cut from resin and sugar, panes that caught and refracted the nebula light into motes and ribbons. They would hang them in the corridors, where the passing crew could shift the colors with a hand and change the mood of an entire passage. It was in the middle of these ordinary exchanges that Lily first noticed the bent canopy. The observation nook was a small alcove stitched with tapestry cushions and a thin telescope that had seen better days. In the pale wash of morning, the canopy did not scream its injury. It revealed itself as a small gesture, a hairline seam that was not quite right, a faint whisper of light leaking where glass met metal. Lily paused with a spoon in mid-air, the molasses drizzle suspended, as if time itself had held its breath. For a while she simply watched the seam. The light that bled through it was a thin thread of clarity, like someone had slipped a seam of dawn into a garment. It looked almost deliberate at first, a little fissure that gave the world a new shape. But then she saw the slight bend in the rim, where the metal had surrendered some inch of its neatness, and felt the small prick of worry settle low in her chest. Seamus noticed before anyone else. He came around the counter with the ease of a man whose attention landed on things like a compass needle finishes its circuit. He rested his palm against the canopy frame, his old, rough fingers making the edges of the metal seem smaller. He said softly, and then, "Needs a careful hand." Rose came, and the twins crept, pretending not to. Conversations folded themselves around the canopy like a careful cloth. No one made a drama of it. There was no need. The ship would be patched. That was the rule among them. Small things were addressed by small hands, preferably early and with tea. But Lily felt the particular tug of responsibility with the seam. It sat in her like an unfinished sentence. The canopy was the ship's eye. People liked to keep it open and neat because it reminded them of wide things. She could imagine the small, patient leaks of light worsening into nuisances, condensation that blurred views, a draft that teased at cushions. She could imagine this. And yet she also loved the way the seam softened the view, how the thin thread of light stitched the stars into a new pattern. For a long minute she balanced the two, the practical measure on one side and the aesthetic, the way a small imperfection could make home more human on the other. "Patch it now?" asked Joss, who liked to fix things quickly. Snap, mend, done. "Not yet," Lily said, and her voice surprised her with its softness. Part of her wanted to call people away from their tasks and set up scaffolds and tape and measures. But part of her wanted the morning to continue. Tea to be made, bread to be bitten, the twins to make a mess of flour. There was no rule that the canopy had to be fixed at once. There was always a choice to let the ship be lived in a little while longer. They chose the living. The seam became a question mark, a small focus in the mind rather than an instruction. Life rearranged around it. Lily tucked a folded cloth under the frame as a temporary measure, and the twins made a hedge of cushions around the nook, a child's fortress against drafts. Seamus moved on to other things, his eye catching on a loose hinge that needed oiling. Rose tended the seedlings, her palms in the shallow trays as if soil could soothe the fret. The galley filled with the sound of utensils and soft conversation. The hum of the hull worked on the edges of thought, smoothing worries as water smooths pebbles. The day settled into its slow, deliberate work. People drifted in and out of the galley, each carrying small items that were portions of their lives. A scarf being mended, a postcard of a place none of them had seen in score years, a jar of preserved citrus that betrayed its maker with a neat label. The ship's rituals made a gentle music, the kettle sigh, the thump of bread being turned, the scissors clip. Lily found something like safety in repetition. Each motion reassured her that nothing catastrophic would arise from a tiny seam. An evening celebration had been planned for days. Nothing elaborate, simply an occasion to hang new Nebula windows along the main corridor and to string the fairy panels like bunting. The community liked ceremonies of that scale. They took the ordinary and gave it the weight of ritual. People made things for it. Mara and Joss had been crafting tiny sugar panes all afternoon, cutting and sanding until the edges were like the margin of a book. Seamus had promised to bring a reel of leather, for he always did things properly when it came to fastening. Rose was baking her tangy citrus loaves, and neighbors had offered ornaments and spare thread. Preparations felt like a chorus of small confidences. Lily found herself writing a list in her head. Fairy panels for the corridor, hooks to clip the panes, a spool of soft wire for the panes' supports, then setting each aside as she moved. She threaded a needle at one point to mend a fray in the twins' favorite cloak and let the rhythm of the stitch ease the little anxiety about the canopy. Stitches were useful. They joined what had been separate. There was something about repair that was a remedy in two senses. Practical, yes, but also moral, a way of saying aloud that broken things could be made better, that care mattered. The ship's hum rose and fell with the day. Clouds beyond the hull shifted like distant thoughts. At one point Lily paused, cup in hand, against the observation nook, and listened as a small rain of glass tapped the window. It was inclement but not hostile, a rain that sounded as if someone far away were practicing a lullaby. She thought of the ways people in old ports would hang little beads at thresholds to catch sun and bless a house. Here they made nebula windows to catch nebula light and bless passages. Trinkets were less valuable than the hands that made them. Visitors arrived in pairs or alone. A neighbor from the other side of the ship brought a tin of biscuits encrusted with candied peel and a small comment about an orbit that had been unusually bright that week. A woman who folded maps into birds for the twins' games came with the faint scent of sea in her voice, though she had never known a sea outside the ship. Conversations were small exchanges, complaints about the kettle's temper, a memory of a song half remembered, the gentle teasing about who had overseed the sprout this week. Nothing needed resolution. People took their small troubles home like parcels to be opened at leisure. Lily moved among them as both participant and witness. She watched hands more than faces, how Seamus polished a small brass button that would fasten a panel, the way Rose scooped soil with a spoon and tipped a seed into a tray, the way Mara folded a pane so that light bent through it like a secret. These were the gestures that mattered to her, the tiny rites that kept a ship from feeling like a machine, and made it feel, instead, like a neighborhood. Once, as the afternoon lazily dissolved, Seamus brought out an old leather case and opened it like someone displaying a small altar. Inside were fastenings and tiny tools, a spool of translucent thread that caught the light and made careful rainbows. He lifted one piece with reverence. "This was my father's," he said, not looking up. "He used to say the world keeps itself with quiet hands." He smiled then, the smile of someone who had seen a few more nights than the rest of them, and kept certain things private because they were not to be traded lightly. Lily felt the warmth of a community in such moments, not loud, not theatrical, but anchored in the sharing of objects and stories. It was closer to a habit than to a ceremony, but the habit itself was the ceremony. As the afternoon softened toward evening, tasks took on an air of preparation rather than work. The twins hung their first sugar panes on a length of wire, stepping back to admire how the pale light refracted through the edges. "It looks like someone put a little storm in a jar," Joss said, and the description landed like a bright pebble in Lily's mind. The seam in the canopy was a quiet humming note beneath all of it. Lily had tucked a strip of leather under the rim and had smoothed the cushions. She found that she could carry attention to two things at once: the joy of making and the care of mending. The ship allowed such divided focus because life on board required it. Small things had a way of being simultaneously urgent and unhurried. They demanded hands, yet permitted thought. Night drew itself like a curtain, and the ship changed its voice. Fairy panels took over the lighting, their small warmed squares making pockets of amber. The hull hum deepened as the ship settled into its rest rate, the sound like a lullaby that had been practiced over many voyages. Lily laid out the sugar panes on a soft cloth, touched the edges with a small, careful finger, and thought about the canopy again, not as a problem, but as an opening. She set a small sand globe on the counter, an old thing the twins loved to turn, watching the grains fall in a slow, private storm. Sand globes were not functional. They did nothing but remind the hands that turned them that time could be seen and measured and loved. She turned it once, watching the grains slow and then settle. The community came together as evening agreed with them. Neighbors trickled in, each adding a small piece to the preparations: hooks, threads, a strip of brass polish, 2 new fairy panels someone had found in a storage locker. Rose brought her citrus loaves, and the scent traveled down the corridor like an invitation. People stood in the galley with the comfortable posture of those who know one another's rhythms well. They made small jokes, shared soft reminiscences, and brought the tools to lay upon the counter like offerings. At one point, Seamus cleared a space on the bench and laid out the tools he thought they might need. He moved with a careful decisiveness that made the rest of them settle like notes finding their harmony. Lily watched him, fingers absently smoothing a sugar pane's edge until it sat flush. "We can do this together," he said simply, as if it were obvious. There was no call for ceremony. The gesture itself was enough. The idea that repair was a communal thing settled over them like a shawl. When they moved toward the observation nook, the act of repair felt less like a reaction, and more like a gathering for a ritual that mended both fabric and fellowship. Seamus lifted the bent canopy with 2 hands, showing the small bend in profile. The seam breathed a thin light. Lily unrolled a length of leather he had brought and laid it along the rim as if the leather were a bandage. Rose threaded a needle with the translucent thread, the eye of it catching the amber light. The twins climbed onto stools and offered bolts of film they had been saving for light play. Their faces were intent, their lips forming small mutations of concentration that were all theirs. The neighbors contributed bits of soft wire, a spare brass button, a length of warm cloth to cushion the newly healed place. They sat together in the small alcove while Seamus began to align the metal with a soft hammer and a cloth pad. Not to bash, but to coax the metal back. He worked slowly, tapping in careful rhythm. Each small blow made a minute surrender, and Lily felt the sound as a sort of heartbeat, the hammer and the hull in a steady conversation. She used a strip of film to strengthen the seam, pressing it into place, and Rose stitched a soft leather lip across the rim where the bend had been most pronounced, her stitches small and patient. The mending was not a single sweeping act, but a choreography of tiny motions. Thread fed through leather, a strip of film smoothed into place, cushions adjusted to accommodate a slightly different contour. Hands met over the canopy in a brief, polite touch of assistance, an exchange that was both practical and intimate. No one hurried. There was space for tea and for jests about who had the strongest fingers. Laughter happened in small spurts, the kind that fits into the cracks of working life. As they worked, they spoke. Short anecdotes that mattered only in the way they filled quiet. Seamus told of a seam he had once mended under a night far colder, when a foolhardy apprentice had tried to use a hot iron on a composite panel and had only succeeded in creating small pocked scars. Rose narrated the stubbornness of a vine she had once coaxed from a seed to a climbing plant that now adorned a corridor. The twins offered facts about the sugar panes, each pronouncement a mixture of earnestness and showmanship. People listened to one another in the way neighbors do, with polite interest and generous attention. There were minor mishaps. A thread slipped, a stitch that puckered and had to be redone. But the mood never rose above an amused tolerance. Mistakes here were not disasters, but small, recoverable events. Someone fetched a tiny clamp to hold the film while Rose tightened the last stitch. Someone else produced a little brass button Seamus persuaded them to use as both reinforcement and ornament. The button had a small embossed swirl that caught the fairy light and made a bright, private sun in the palm. As the canopy took shape again, Lily thought about the way living involved continual small healings. The ship itself was never finished. Something was always being retouched, polished, adjusted. Such ongoing work made each corner intimate, each patch a story. She found comfort in that. Repair was a visible record of care. They paused now and then to test the alignment. Seamus would close the canopy, and the click of the latch would tell them the truth. If it held, the seam was right. If it resisted, they went back. The click was an exact, small sound, one that could make a room hush without anyone saying a word. Each time the canopy shut and the latch clicked, a private relief spread through the group like warmth. It was not applause so much as acknowledgement. We did the thing together, and the thing now would live again. By the time the canopy was largely mended, dusk had settled properly, and the nebula beyond had thickened into deeper blues. The sugar panes that had been arranged through the day took on a new purpose. They were threaded along the corridor, catching and coloring the busy of the night. Fairy panels were clipped into place with the care of garland makers, and the galley was lit in warm patches. They stood back, not dramatizing the moment, but noting it with an ease that suggested such small celebrations were simply how they kept going. Someone brought out a crate of jellied fruits, a treat contributed by a neighbor, as if there had been no test at all. Lily passed the tray, offering sweets and accepting laughter in return. The twins lay their head against Rose's knee, and were told a small story about a sprout that had once tried to grow into a library. The story was half absurd and wholly tender. Lily found herself in the doorway of the observation nook, looking out over the ship that had been coaxed back into shape. The seam, once an exposed question, was now a decorative line, edged in leather and slotted with a small brass button that looked inexplicably proud. It would need checking again in time. This was not a final victory, but it would also hold for nights to come. She felt the ship's hum, as always, steady and companionable, now threaded with the memory of hands. It was easy to think that the ship had a mind like a living creature. It took wounds and healed. It kept a record in patches and in the scent left by repair, leather and tow, and the faint metallic tang that comes with bending old frames. It was a mind that remembered kindness as much as knots. The celebration continued in gentler tones. Someone produced a small, thin musical box that gave a few notes when wound. They hummed along beside it, voices low, folding into the ship's natural pitch. The twins fell asleep under a scatter of new sugar panes, their chests rising and falling like small tides. Rose collected plates and placed them in a tidy stack, her hands moving as if smoothing the day into place. Lily walked back to the galley and tidied the last of the cups away. She placed the sand globe beside the stove, turned it once more and watched the slow fall of grains as if it were a private metronome. The canopy had been mended, but in the back of her mind she kept a small space for the seam's earlier light, the way imperfection had redrawn the stars. She liked that both things could be true at once, that they had fixed what needed fixing, and had also held on to the way a flaw might, in the right hands, become a form of beauty. She moved, finally, to her cabin with the soft relief of someone who has handed back the day into rest. The ship's hum guided her steps, a quiet companion along the corridor. She paused at the observation nook, now draped in the newly hung Nebula panes, their colors bleeding softly onto cushions and floor. Lily arranged them with a last, light touch, and then tucked a small cloth over the edge of the canopy, as if tucking a sleeve into place. She climbed into bed with a mind that was not empty, but pleasantly laden. The names of those who had come, the weight of hands on leather, the small pride of the twins in their sugar panes. The kettle in the galley hissed out its last breath. Somewhere in the ship, Seamus's chair creaked as he settled. Rose whispered something to no one, and everyone at once. Outside, the glass rain kept playing its small percussion, and the hull hummed, patient as always. Lily lay listening to the constellation of domestic noises that made a ship feel less like a vessel and more like a village. She thought of Voyager's Rest, not as a formal name, but as a sense. This was a home that traveled, that rested in the great dark and offered a hearth to those who made its paths. Lonely, perhaps, if one thought of empty spaces, but not desolate. It was a loneliness that was held, a solitude folded into the fabric of many hands. There was still time before sleep. Lily reached out and placed a small, warm packet on the bedside table, one of Rose's citrus loaves halved and wrapped in linen. She liked the way giving something small could smooth the mind. It was an act of tidy mercy. She turned the sand globe once more, watching the grains drop like tiny stars deciding to rest. From the berth came a soft sound. The twins murmuring in their sleep, dreaming of sugar storms and paper birds. Lily smiled to herself and closed her eyes. Outside, through the pane, a thin ribbon of light shivered where the canopy had once been bent. It was narrower now, coaxed into a decorative line. She told herself, not for the first time, that living required little stitches, and that trust could be sewn into seams as well as spoken in words. Sleep came on slow wings. In the half-awake place, Lily rehearsed the small tasks of tomorrow, checking the canopy's leather, harvesting a few seedlings, perhaps taking one of the sugar panes to hang by the lower hatch. She thought of Seamus's hands and Rose's patience and the twins' wide, unsteady joy. The ship hummed in reply, and somewhere deep in its bones she felt the echo of the day's quiet work. When worry came, soft and almost polite, she allowed it its small corner and then let it be held by the memory of the night's gathering. They had repaired what was needed, and also left room for the seam to remain a little of what it had been, an imperfection made domestic. It felt like a kind of promise, that things could be attended to with care and laughter, that the ship would hold them as they moved through the vastness. The hum and the rain and the small motes of fairy light stitched themselves into a single hush. Lily placed her palm against the cool glass for a heartbeat, feeling the hull's faint give, and whispered no prayer. Only a quiet thank you, the kind of gratitude that had no loud verbs, just the soft muscles of thanks gathering and releasing. Then she slept. Sometime after she slept, in that thin room between night and none, the ship shifted its weight as if to settle a dream. Lily stirred, not because sleep had been broken so much as because the body remembers certain small duties even while the mind is still soft. She turned on her side and listened. The hum was there, a steady marine note as patient as a tide. The glass rain tapped in the same gentle cadence it always did, a distant, delicate percussion that sounded like fingers tracing the margin of the world. She rose and padded to the observation nook before her head had cleared of the last dream. The nebula panes cast slow, sleeping colors across the cushions. One of the twins' paper birds, forgotten on the sill, had a wing dipped in blue. The leather edge of the canopy held the faint impression of Seamus's hand where he had worked, warm and smelling of tow and brass. Lily pressed her palm to the cool glass, feeling the hull's minimal give, the almost breath. For a moment she imagined that the ship regarded them as a gardener regards those he tends, a steady, unobtrusive attention. Down in the galley, someone moved the kettle with the soft ministry of early hours. Lily could hear the quiet scrape of a spoon and the soft voice of Seamus, murmuring a phrase she could not quite catch. The ship's rooms were close enough that even at night their neighbors were present in sigh and small sound. That closeness felt like a blessing. She wrapped a shawl about her shoulders and went downstairs. The galley was lit by the glow of a single fairy panel, honey-bright and private. Seamus was there, sitting with his knees pulled up to the bench and a tin of tins on his lap as though he were reading a book. He looked up when Lily came in, and the motion between them was wordless and easy. Rose sat opposite with a shallow tray of seedlings under her hands, each one sleeping in its bed of damp compost. The twins were not yet at the counter. Both still claimed the last of their wakefulness for quiet inventions under the bench. "Thought you might need a cup," Seamus said, as if making the most obvious gesture in the world. Lily took the cup he offered and felt the heat anchor her. They did not speak about the canopy. there was no need to. The night's repair was a thing stitched into their day now, a small seam in the ship's skin that would be monitored in the mornings and settled over time. Instead, they talked of softer things, a neighbor's tin of jellies that a child had declared miraculous, the odd warmth of a corridor that had been baffling them for weeks, the twins' latest plan to string sugar panes across the lower hatch like a curtain. Rose looked up from her seedlings and smiled. "I kept 2 back," she said, tapping the tray, "for when you like company in the nook." Lily felt the warmth of the offer as she always did, less a favor than a promise. Community on Voyager's Rest worked like that. Things came with a padding of affection, a small stocking of trust, a quiet catalogue of obligations fulfilled with a smile. She accepted the seedlings, and, for the smallest instant, pictured them in the nook between cushions and panels, their green like a private sky. When the twins finally emerged, they were carrying a string of small glass motes they had scavenged from a box labeled decorations, possibly alive. Joss had soldered 2 of the motes into a tiny cluster that made a hush of tinkling sound when shaken. Mara had sanded another pane until its edge flashed like a smile. They deposited their work on the bench with the solemnity of priests offering relics. The morning that followed was ordinary in all the ways Lily loved. They ate cloud bread and citrus loaves, passed a tin of biscuits around, and organized the day with the casual efficiency of those who live by small lists. Fairy panels were adjusted to catch the softer angles of light. The kettle made its measured size. The hall hummed steady background music. A neighbor wandered in to borrow a spool of soft wire, and stayed for the simple pleasure of being in a room where hands were busy and voices slack with comfortable amusement. Over the next week, the ship settled into a new pattern. The canopy was checked each morning, and every now and then nudged into better alignment. Leather was re-oiled, and a tiny patch of film smoothed again where a trickle of condensation had appeared. These were attentions that required nothing but time, and the kind of small competence that Seamus possessed and enjoyed best. Lily discovered a satisfaction in the repeat, an action that could be done properly and without show. Ritual, she had long thought, was not only for ceremonies. It lived in the measured stroke of a brush of oil, the practice of bringing seedlings into a light, the habit of testing a lock to hear its honest click. There were small gifts given and traded. Rose presented Lily with one of the trays, 2 seedlings of a hardy, variegated sprout that would trail in a particular way along the nook. "It likes the dim," Rose said. "I thought it might keep company with the stars." Lily accepted it as she accepted a handful of clear sky, quietly with a plan for how it would sit and be tended. Seamus sometimes left little repairs for Lily to find. A polished button tucked into a drawer, perhaps, or a small piece of cloth stitched into the hem of an apron. The twins made more sugar panes, each one an experiment in light and bite. One was puckered and sweeter than the others, saved for emergencies or celebrations. Neighbors from other parts of the vessel drifted through more regularly now that the repair had been completed. Passing hands lingered on counters. A name was exchanged, and stories were retold in slivers. Lily liked the way those stories sat beside her own life as a kind of wallpaper, unobtrusive, decorative, and occasionally instructive. She thought often of the ship's name, which the group used half-jokingly and half-devoutly. Voyager's Rest was not a name in the sense of a label affixed to steel. It was a character trait, a pronoun for a place that moved yet offered pause. There were evenings when the celebration of small things almost became its own calendar. They would choose particular nights to hang new Nebula windows, an event that required making, polishing, and the communal labor of stringing. The twins liked to measure where a pane ought to hang by stretching a piece of wool between two hooks and stepping back as though they were critics evaluating a painting. Someone would hold the pane up while another adjusted a clip, and a third would thread a tiny prism through so that when the corridor was crossed, a rain of color followed the traveler like a blessing. One of those work nights was particularly full of small rituals. The galley had been tidied and cleared of clutter. The ferry panels were arranged in a low arc, and the bench bore a small museum of tools, files, clamps, a bottle of polish, and a spool of soft wire. Rose laid out her citrus loaves on a tray, while Seamus set the tin of fastenings like a centerpiece. Lily found herself involved in the minutiae she usually enjoyed, measuring lengths of wire, testing whether a clip would fit without scratching the pane, threading tiny brass rings that would hold the motes. They worked to the low music of the ship. The hull hummed, the kettle gave a nominal sigh in the distance. The sugar panes chimed occasionally as the twins arranged them on the bench. Conversation came in fragments. Seamus spoke of the small challenges of persuading an old hinge to play nicely. Rose talked about a sprout that had decided, without consulting anyone, to flower twice in a single orbit. The twins offered play-by-play commentary of their techniques, where to press sugar to encourage a flake to form a crescent, how to score an edge so light would refract like a story. At one point, a neighbor produced a box of thin brass discs, discovered in some forgotten locker. They were the color of old coins, and took the fairy light like coins take a face. Seamus polished one, and held it to his eye like a magnifier, then affixed the discs along the trim of a particularly long pane. It became a small ceremony. Each disc represented something. An orbit counted, a kindness returned, a small regret excused. The pane looked, when it was finished, as if it had been sewn with the memory of other nights. They carried the new windows to the corridor in a procession that was neither solemn nor casual. Hands balanced, voices low, laughter kept in the ribs. The act of hanging them had a pace like prayer, each motion simple and sure. When the last pane clicked into place, someone tugged the corridor's rope so that the cloud of panes swung and refracted the nebula light. A hush followed, less a silence than an intake of private breath, and then a round of soft applause, as if the gesture were both craft and consecration. That night, the corridor had become more than passage. It was a slow, luminous river. Passing through it felt like moving under a canopy of small stars. The twins held hands as they walked beneath their own work and twinkled with an unconcerned pride. Neighbors lingered a little longer in doorways. The ship's hum seemed to modulate, as though pleased by the added ornaments. If things intangible could be pleased at all. In the days that sifted onward, Lily found herself paying more attention to the small artifacts that made up their life. She discovered that the sugar panes had become talismans for private moods. One was for evenings when you wanted to remember the taste of an old port. Another for mornings with a forecast of rain. A third for times when someone needed to be coaxed into cheer. They learned to use objects as language. A tin on the counter meant wrap up and leave soon. A particular fairy panel arranged just so meant tonight. Perhaps, let's make space for talk. She also discovered a quiet delight in teaching a small set of skills to the twins. Lily took to showing them how to mend a seam so that the stitches held without puckering, how to thread the translucent line so it lay flat rather than twisting into knots. They watched her hands as if studying the sky, absorbing the rhythms of movements that had no sudden flourish but were steady and right. Mara asked the most patient questions. Joss wanted the quick wins. Lily answered both, and in doing so she felt as if she were handing down something necessary, an apprenticeship in kindness. One morning, as their orbit passed through a stretch of nebula that made the hull look powdered with blue flour, Lily found a note tucked under the sand globe. It was from Seamus, written in his compact scrawl. "Check the Nook tonight. Little thing, might be nothing. Tea if you want company." Seamus seldom left notes. He preferred actions, so this smallness felt like a hand extended. Lily folded the paper and put it into her pocket with the same deliberateness she used to fold cloth. That night she did go to the Nook. Seamus was there already, his chair tilted, a strand of translucent thread wound around his finger. He had set a small cup between them. The kettle hissed in the background once and then fell silent. He offered her a biscuit and a look that carried less news than a companionable ease. "The leather's holding," he said after a while, as if they were discussing weather. "But the film's puckering a touch when the temperatures dip. I've ordered a strip from storage. It should do the trick. No hurry. Something to keep our hands tidy." Lily listened and let herself be anchored by the exchange. They spoke of the small maintenance of living together, the errands, the stocks of supplies, the way to rotate the seedlings so the weak ones had a day in the light. They did not recount big stories. Instead, they shared the quiet compounds of life. The way a drawer stuck sometimes, the best way to smooth a pane without smudging, who had left a favorite spoon in the wash. It was intimacy measured in the geometry of things, and Lily loved it for being precisely that. Outside, the whole rain kept time. The ship held them in a private weather of patter and pulse. Lily thought, not for the first time, that Voyager's rest might be more accurately described as a promise. That on this vessel, moving through a sea of nebula and stars, there were people who would notice the small details of each other's days, who would take on an unnoticed seam and make it better without spectacle. On a particular afternoon that unfolded later, Rose asked Lily to help press some citrus loaves for a neighbor who was celebrating a personal milestone of sorts. A small, private conquest involving a repaired harness and a successfully coaxed seedling. They wrapped loaves in linen and tucked little notes into each parcel. An embroidered stitch here, a sugar pane there, a message of plain congratulations. The act of preparing food to be given away felt like a further kind of mending, an exchange of edible comfort that sealed a social seam. There were times, too, when Lily let herself be still without doing anything that could be counted. She sometimes sat by the observation panel with a cup of tea and the sand globe at her feet and watched the nebula move. Occasionally she read aloud to the twins, not a long tale, but a line or two of something that sounded like an older map. They would interrupt her with small questions. How do you make the sugar panes shine like that? Why do the seeds sleep in winter? And she would answer in the patient, measured way she answered the hull, with a hand on the question and a turn of the voice. The repairs and celebrations changed little about the vastness beyond the glass. Nebula was still nebula, beautiful, indifferent, quietly enormous. But inside the hull the world felt right-sized, made of hands and cups and small repeated gestures. Lily sometimes imagined that if they could bottle that particular climate, equal parts repair and play, of bread and mending and the slow music of the hull, they would never need to feel alone again. That imagining was not grandiose. It was simply true in the small way that matters in daily life. As the weeks turned, the ship accumulated more ornaments, a small brass compass that had lost its needle, a faded scarf that someone had stitched into a curtain, a mobile of tiny glass moons that the twins hung over a bunk to catch dreamlight. Each edition was a vote for home. The observation nook became a little repository of these votes. A sprig of variegated green, a sand globe, a neat coil of soft wire, a sugar pane with a tiny brass button sewn onto its corner. Lily would often pause in the doorway and look at the collection as one might look at a small town square. Familiar, crowded with meaning. There were minor tensions now and then, a disagreement over the best place to hang a particular pane, a debate about the frequency of communal meals, the eternal wrangle of whose turn it was to clean the kettle. These things passed as they had always done, resolved with tea, sometimes with a stitch in a garment, sometimes with sheer, cheerful stubbornness. The ship's hum had an accommodating quality. It listened to such small disputes as if to reassure them they, too, were part of the voyage. One evening, the ship's mood was touched by a different shade, when a neighbor from the lower passages arrived with a story of a small kindness received from someone on another vessel. They told how a lost spool of thread had been returned with a note that read only, "Keep the color." The story made everyone lean in. It was as though that small event rippled through their own practices, reminding them that kindness existed beyond their own hull. They drank the tea with a new sense of connection, as if the fabric of their community had been extended by a single bright stitch. Not every day, of course, was marked by ceremony. Many days slipped by in the comfortable hum of predictable tasks. Seedlings tended, bread baked, small repairs performed. Lily found peace in that predictability. She liked the way routine could reveal hidden joys, how the last crumb of molasses tasted better than the first, how the twins' laughter sounded richer when accompanied by the chime of a sugar pane, how the hull's hum crept into dreams and carried away the edges of old anxieties. At night, as their orbit swung through denser patches of nebula and the outer glass caught the light in new, shifting patterns, the crew of Voyager's Rest discovered a new way of practicing consolation. On an impulse, one late evening, while the twins were asleep and Seamus and Rose had retreated to their bunks, Lily arranged the observation nook as a tiny, private theater. She and a neighbor sat and watched the motes of nebula light sift across the cushions. They spoke little. Words seemed too clumsy for what they were doing. Instead, they shared the sigh of appreciation that comes when a place you love performs for you. That was a motif that returned often. People making small theaters of ordinary corners. It was practical, too. The warmth made an afternoon nap gentler. The light made seedlings perk up. But there was also a social pleasure in it. Living inside a moving vessel meant that every nook could be made into a stage with only a little thought and a set of fairy panels. There came a quieter day in which Lily reflected on the nature of the word lonely. In the morning she had read a leaflet that a traveler had folded and left in the galley. It was a map of ports someone had once kept and had annotated with a pen. Small notes about which markets sold the best tea, which docks had the best bread. The word lonely had been scored out on the margin, replaced with held. Lily thought of that and liked it. Voyager's Rest was at once lonely, and not a place that offered solitude without desertion. It was a vessel that moved through vast and beautiful emptiness, but inside it had a gravity of hands and small rituals that made it more a village than an island. As spring light, if such a thing can be called that when you move through nebula, shifted and softened the ship's panels, they prepared for a simple ritual of thanksgiving. Not a religious ceremony, but a communal acknowledgement. A meal shared, a round of small stories, and the habitual checking of seams. The twins prepared a small play in which a sprout became a ladder and a sugar pane turned into a ship. It was absurd and tender. People clapped with voices that were somehow both amused and proud. The repairs continued in the background of their life. Oilings, small realignments, checks that the leather remained supple. Those acts of care were narratively unexciting but emotionally essential. They were proof that the vessel would continue to be tended, that the seam would not be forgotten, that attention could be both mundane and profound. And then, on an evening that had the exact density of meaning one could wish for, Lily performed the long private ritual that she had kept for herself. She set the sand globe upon the counter and turned it slowly 3 times, each revolution a small mark against her own list of days. She laid out a slice of the citrus loaf, wrapped it in linen, and placed it on her bedside table. She smoothed the cushions in the observation nook and moved the sugar panes until their colors pleased her. She lit a fairy panel and let its honey light spread, then turned off the overheads so that the ship could fold into warm pockets. Before she climbed into bed, she went through the galley one last time and quieted the kettle's last breath. She paused by the bench and, on a small impulse, took from the drawer the little brass compass they had mended months earlier. It was imperfect. Its needle jittered when held, but its face had a softness and a memory. Lily tucked it into her pocket, not because she expected to use it, but because it was a token of hands that had held theirs steady. She checked the observation nook, smoothing a rag across the leather trim of the canopy, feeling the small roughness of stitching under her palm. The seam, now decorated and bordered, glowed faintly in the diffuse light. She thought of the way they had chosen to live in minor attentions, how many small stitches it had required to keep the ship not only functional, but humane. She arranged the seedlings so they would catch the morning light, and then turned the sand globe once more, slower now, watching the grains fall as though they were small, obedient stars. When she climbed into bed, she did not feel the need to rehearse the day. The work had been done, and its memory lay like a comfortable shawl across her shoulders. She lay there listening to the hull hum and the distant patter of glass rain, and felt the intimate arithmetic of shared lives. The tally of cups poured, screws tightened, words kept, songs hummed. Inside the vessel, the world was composed of a constellation of small acts, and those acts had, today and always, made a city where none was expected. She thought, softly, of the name again, Voyager's Rest. The title seemed to settle over her like a map folded round a pocket. It was not a triumphant name. It was an honest one. It said, "We travel, and in traveling we are allowed to stop and be a harbor for one another." It acknowledged the vastness outside and the smallness inside, and it made peace with both. As the ship slowed into its night rate, an old habit returned. Lily placed the small wrapped loaf within reach of her bedside hand, not so much for hunger as for the assurance that someone had given something into the night. She reached out and laid her palm on the glass for one last time, feeling the faint, familiar give of the hull. In the dark, the canopy's leather smelled faintly of tow and molasses. The scent stitched itself to memory. She allowed her breath to match the ship's hum, longer out, softer in, until the vessel and her chest sang the same note. When worry came, a small, polite thing that always arrived with the far-off hush of unanswerable questions, she let it sit on the pillow beside her, and did not give it more room than a single eye. She felt held, not because the ship was a fortress against everything, but because hands had chosen to be steady. A small sound came from the corridor, the twins sleepwalking in a minor dream, colliding and laughing softly into each other before falling back into slumber. A neighbor closed a door with the gentle care of someone tucking a blanket. The hull rain continued to mark the world in clicks and tiny percussions. Lily smiled in the dark and let that sound, so like a lullaby, carry her away. In the half-light before full sleep, she thought of the repairs yet to come, the film to be smoothed, a button to be rebounded, a seam to be checked. She did not worry about them as storms. She filed them into a quiet ledger of future tasks, small tasks that would become tomorrow's rituals. The idea of repairing, of tending, of offering and accepting care felt to her like a way of speaking the language of belonging. Outside, the nebula pressed its silent forehead to the glass. Inside, the ship breathed and settled. Voyager's rest moved on, its hull collecting small stories like shells. It did not promise safety from all sorrows. It offered instead the steady lateness of company, and the modest guarantee that broken things could be taken in hand and mended by those who cared. Lily fell asleep with the image of the canopy in her mind. A healed seam, laced with leather and softened with a brass button, the sugar panes glittering like a private constellation beyond it. The ship hummed its long, patient tone. She dreamed, briefly, of a room full of small doors opening and the sound of cups being set down in cups, an echo chamber of kindness. When she woke the next morning, the light was the color of old coins. The ship had gathered a freshness overnight, and the air tasted, briefly, like clean linen. She rose and performed the familiar domestic choreography. Kettle, fairy panels, a quick hand at the seedlings, each action precise and restorative. There was no grand tableau to be made. The world simply continued in its quiet way. But in its continuance lay a comfort that felt, to Lily, almost sacramental. Neighbors passed through the galley with the easy politeness of those who know each other's rhythms. The twins offered a sugar pane to anyone who would accept it as a token. Seamus sat with a cup and a cloth and polished the newly fitted brass button until it threw back a small, honest shine. Rose presented Lily with a tiny leaf she had pruned from a sprout, an offering of green that, like the seedlings before, promised small growth. Lily took the leaf and tucked it into a small saucer by the window. She straightened a fairy panel until its light was even, and watched as the pattern of the nebula rearranged itself across the cushions. There was a steadiness to the morning that made her feel grateful in a particular ache-smoothing way. She moved through the day as one moves through a familiar room, with knowing steps and with the small delight that comes from recognizing how everything is placed. Later, when the evening descended and the corridor glowed under the new nebula windows, Lily sat in the observation nook and regarded the ship, not as an object, but as a community thing that held them in a slow, tidal way. The canopy bore its small scar like an old sailor's line. The hull hummed as if the vessel remembered who had mended it. She thought of all the hands that had touched the seam, the roughness of Seamus's palms, Rose's delicate needlework, the twins' bright, unskilled fingers, and she felt, very clearly, that belonging was a practice as much as a feeling. She made one final, private circuit of the galley. She placed the sand globe on the shelf where the morning light would spill over it, and then arranged the fairy panels so that their warmth would catch the seedlings in the nook. She tucked a small piece of molasses bread into a bag and left it on the bench with a note that read only, "For a later day." It was a small act, useless and perfect. She felt, in doing it, that she had given the day a punctuation mark. As night folded the ship into its slow, listening mode, Lily climbed into bed and let the hum take up its work. She listened to the glass rain and to the small neighborly sounds of movement about the vessel. She felt the twin sensations of solitude that was chosen and of company that was steady. Voyager's rest moved in its long, elegant arc, a vessel of quiet life on the vast, dark sea. If, when you lay in bed, and the world outside your window seems too large, you want a companion for a little while, breathe with theirs. Turn over the sand in your hands. Count the small lights. Let the hull hum be a pillow. Imagine the seam, like a thin tail, stitched by many hands. Let that thought be enough. Let the hum be your pillow. Good night from Voyager's Rest.